The immediate concern for us is the emergency preparation in case of flooding. As everyone has heard over the days, Lake Ontario is just at about flood level. Lake Erie is at flood level. So we have a problem along the entire northern coast of the state. I would like to say this is new and novel, but it's not. As a matter of fact, I've been at this exact spot talking about the exact same issue in the past. We had tremendous flooding in 2017. In terms of emergency preparation, we're working together with local communities. We're working here with County Executive D'Onofrio's operation and Dave Seeley, et cetera, to do everything we can to protect the shoreline. There are two issues with flooding. Number one is the increase in the overall water table, which right now we're at about flood height. If there's more rain, if the IJC releases less water, you'll see that water table rise. Even if the water table doesn't rise itself, today is a beautiful, calm day. But if the wind picks up and the wave action picks up, then even though you're not at flood height, the waves will come over the shoreline. And that is probably the most likely scenario that we're looking at now. The wave action, which is our greatest concern. What can we do? We can fortify the shoreline in places where it needs it and it's accessible. Sandbags, there's a new device that we deploy now that you see out behind me called an aqua dam. What is an aqua dam? It's a large rubber tube, essentially, that gets filled with water and acts as an emergency dam, and it can provide an additional 2 or 3 feet of protection. Obviously, you need an extended period of point to deploy the aqua dam. In the tour we just did, there are several spots where we think we can put up an aqua dam. If there are private residences who don't have a retaining wall or not up high, and they think the aqua dam would be helpful to protect their property, they should let us know, because we're ready to deploy it. The National Guard, we have 100 members of the National Guard here. They'll be doing sandbags. They can also help deploy the aqua dam. So that's what we're doing on an emergency level. Longer term, we're going to have to acknowledge that this is going to be a continuing problem. We now treat them as emergencies. People tell me this is a 1 in a 100-year flood. I'm told 5 times a year that this is a 1 in a 100-year flood. The old rules are gone, in my opinion. These record levels, I believe, are going to be recurring. So we spent $100 million from the state last time rebuilding properties. We have to think about building back better than before and different than before. What was a satisfactory retaining wall is no longer a satisfactory retaining wall. We're going to have to think about rebuilding our shorelines to a higher capacity. That is the new reality that we're dealing with. It's more cost effective in the long term, rather than just rebuilding after emergency to the same level. Let's acknowledge that it's a different reality and we have to build differently. The shoreline has to be more protected. And that is a new acknowledgement. Congressman Morelli was speaking this week, and I think correctly so. The federal government is talking about a $2 trillion infrastructure program. I hope that is true. First, as a general rule, this country needs infrastructure badly. Our airports, our roads, they're all out of date. But part of that $2 trillion, if it actually becomes a reality in Washington, should be used to rebuild our shorelines, such as the shoreline along Lake Ontario, to make sure we're prepared for these new weather realities. And I hope that happens. Any funding that the state appropriates in the future will also be geared towards rebuilding back better than before and building back to these new standards and the new reality. We also have an ongoing issue with the IJC, which regulates the water level in the lakes, and they're all connected. So what happens in Lake Erie affects Lake Ontario, St. Lawrence, etc. And I am, frankly, disappointed with the IJC's management. I don't mean to cast aspersions on the IJC, but their job is to manage the flow and level of water. And when you have flooding, by definition, the IJC is not appropriately managed the water, period. If you're managing the water flow, there would not be flooding. We now wind up in these situations where the IJC says, well, there's flooding in Canada, and if we release more water, we're going to increase the flooding in Canada. We shouldn't have gotten into this situation in the first place. They should have been releasing more water earlier. You can't keep saying, when we get to this point, well, now I have no choice. You had a choice. You had a choice earlier to release more water so we wouldn't get to this place. We know that there's snowpack and the snowpack is going to melt and the water levels are going to rise. The only sensible solution is to prevent the problem rather than getting into the situation and say, well, now we have a conundrum. I can't release more water because I'll increase the flooding somewhere else. And we've gone through this situation enough times where we know what is going to happen. Why do we just keep repeating the madness, right? The definition of insanity. We had a meeting with the IJC this past week. The meeting was, in my opinion, unsatisfactory. First of all, the IJC was supposed to appoint a member from New York. There is a New York member that has been nominated. Jane Corwin, she was a member of the State Assembly. She's from Western New York. I worked with her when she was in Albany. At least give us a New Yorker on the IJC so someone can speak about protecting New York. She has not yet been put in that position. And I think the federal government should do that immediately because we need representation on the IJC, and there's no way around that. At the meeting that was had with the New York State officials, they listened, they were polite, but they didn't commit to anything. They're going to look at a number of issues. They're going to look at 24-hour monitoring of the lake, so at least we have notice of what's happening. They're going to look at better communication so we know what to expect. They're going to look at increasing the release of water, and they made some small progress in that regard, but it's not satisfactory from my opinion. I want to applaud all the first responders who are working literally around the clock to do everything they can do to be ready. You know, we hope for the best, but we prepare for the worst. And you have hundreds of people who are doing all sorts of work to try to get ready. But Mother Nature is a fearsome force, and if that wind picks up and those waves start, there's going to be very little we can do, unfortunately. And that's why the real solution is twofold. To the IJC, make sure we don't wind up in this situation in the first place. And then we have to have a new acknowledgement that we have to rebuild to different standards because these standards don't work anymore, period. It would be a fool's errand to come out here today and say, well, this is a once in a 100-year situation. It's not. It happened 2 years ago. So let's acknowledge the reality and let's respond to it because the reality isn't going to change. With that, any questions for myself, my colleagues, County Executive, Senator Funke, Assembly Member Romeo, Supervisor Dave Seeley?
You said you're going to build to a new way. What's that going to look like?
Well, knock wood, hopefully we don't have damage from this situation. Hopefully we don't have the winds, we don't have the waves, hopefully we don't have increased rain. hopefully we don't have significant flooding. If we do, then first, you do everything you can to handle the emergency. Step two is then rebuilding. Federal government can provide rebuilding funds, state can provide rebuilding funds. But my point there would be, if we get to that, don't rebuild what was. Rebuild it to a higher standard. Don't replace the retaining wall that was overcome, build a higher retaining wall. Don't build a home in that same place without protection. Make sure you have protection for that home. It would be a smarter, better use of those funds. If we get to that point, again, we're still on the hopeful stage that we don't have any significant flooding. But if we do, then I would advocate, rather than just replacing everything, anticipate these higher levels and build to a level that protects against them.
Are you saying the state's going to do it, or the residents? And if the residents do it, will they use a grant or funds?
I'm saying if we get to that place, and if there are federal funds for emergency rebuilding, which there are usually after a significant rebuilding, after a significant emergency in rebuilding, or state funds, then yes, rebuild better than before. You want to comment? Anyone?
You mentioned that if residents that have private properties on the shoreline, if they fear that they may be their properties may be in jeopardy, that they should contact. Who should they contact?
They can contact the county, who will then contact us, or they can contact Supervisor Seeley's office in the case of Arundecoit. The aqua dam you see behind us, we can deploy that on private property if we have permission from the owners. So it's up to the private owners. We saw a few residences which are basically at water level. They're basically at shoreline. And if a private owner gives us permission, we can install that aqua dam, which isn't a perfect solution, but it does provide several feet of protection from oncoming waves. Anyone else have a comment?
There's been erosion going on since 2017 that I've noticed. The beaches look different, the waterfronts look different. Is this something that the state should be proactive at putting in seawalls or something?
Well, to protect the shoreline, the northern shoreline is a massive undertaking. You're talking about from Buffalo, right, all across the state. And that's why I mentioned Congressman Morelli's point that if the federal government actually does do this $2 trillion infrastructure program that the president announced, and I'm hopeful, we've had a lot of announcements out of Washington, we've had very little action. But if this announcement actually turns out to be a reality and there is $2 trillion to do infrastructure, this should be one of the eligible activities. Okay, thank you all very much.